Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title echoes in the shadows. The sun had barely crested over the horizon when a lone jogger, Megan Summers, found herself in the thick woods near the edge of the college campus, her breath misting in the crisp morning air. The early hours provided solitude, and the soft padding of her footsteps echoed along the dirt trail. She slowed as she noticed something unusual ahead. A bright, unnatural splash of color that didn't belong among the browns and greens of the forest floor. Squinting, Megan stepped closer and froze. It was a woman. A young woman lying twisted at an odd angle, her limbs splayed as if posed deliberately. Blood marred her clothing, dark and crusted in the dim morning light. Megan's pulse quickened, her breath shallow and ragged as she backed away in horror. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed 911. The operator's voice crackled over the line. 911, what's your emergency? Megan took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing herself to speak clearly. I found someone. A woman. She's dead. Detective Rachel Torres arrived at the scene just as dawn broke, casting a pale light over the campus woods. She was used to crime scenes, used to the unrelenting violence of human nature, but something about this one felt different. Something more visceral. The victim lay on the cold ground, her eyes staring blankly into the distance, limbs arranged in a way that seemed almost intentional. Rachel took in every detail, the bruises on the victim's wrists, the jagged tears in her clothing, the trail of blood that had smeared across the leaves. Rachel's partner, Officer James Grant, stepped up beside her, his face pale. She was a student here, he said quietly. Freshman, Emily Reeds. Rachel nodded, her gaze scanning the surrounding area. Let's secure the perimeter. I want every inch of this place searched. There might be something left behind, something we can use. Grant nodded, already calling in a request for additional officers. Rachel leaned closer to the body, noting a faint scuff mark on a nearby tree and a partial shoe print in the mud beside it. They were faint, but to her trained eye, they might as well have been shouting. Emily, who did this to you? She murmured under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. As the forensic team worked, Rachel began interviewing anyone who might have seen or heard something. Campus security provided surveillance footage, but it was spotty. Only a few cameras worked near the edges of the campus, and none seemed to capture anything useful. Rachel reviewed what she could, eyes glued to the screen, searching for any sign of a figure lurking in the background or a car driving slowly past. Days passed, and the fear in the town became palpable. Local news stations reported on Emily's murder, broadcasting the details that Rachel had hoped to keep quiet. The brutality of the crime, the unsettling way the body had been left. Students were terrified, their parents even more so. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed there was a cult targeting young women. Others suggested a disturbed former student with a vendetta against the university. Rachel worked tirelessly, poring over evidence, following leads that went nowhere. She was determined, but each day that passed without answers gnawed at her. Then, another body was found. This time, it was in an alley near a row of student apartments, far from the secluded woods where Emily had been discovered. The victim was posed similarly, her arms arranged just so, her face expressionless in death. Rachel felt a jolt of frustration and horror as she took in the scene. This killer was growing bolder, leaving bodies in more visible locations, almost as if taunting the police. As she examined the area, she found another partial footprint, this time a clearer impression on the damp ground. The shoe size and pattern were consistent with the one found near Emily's body. Back at the precinct, Rachel pored over the case files, examining each detail meticulously. The shoe prints, the method of the killings, the positioning of the bodies, all pointed to a mind that was not only calculating but reveling in control. This was no crime of passion. It was something far darker. Rachel's mind began piecing together theories. She reached out to colleagues in other states, inquiring about similar cases, hoping for some pattern that could explain the motive. But nothing fit exactly. The killer's style was unique, chillingly methodical. News of the second murder sent waves of panic through the town. Students stopped going out at night, and parents pressured the university to close down until the killer was caught. Rachel faced pressure from all sides, the media demanding answers, her superiors breathing down her neck for results, the families of the victims pleading for justice. She was relentless, spending late nights in her office, drinking too much coffee, and pushing herself to exhaustion. Then, one night, as she was poring over the case files, she received an envelope. No return address, no stamps, just her name scrawled in a tight, spidery handwriting. She opened it, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. For words stared back at her. "You're getting closer, detective." A chill ran down her spine. Whoever this killer was, they were watching her, tracking her progress, taunting her. Rachel began spending more time on campus, speaking with students and faculty, anyone who might have a connection to the victims. One evening, as she walked through the campus square, she noticed a young woman walking alone, clutching her books tightly to her chest, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. Rachel's instincts kicked in, and she followed the young woman from a distance. Just as she suspected, a shadowy figure appeared behind the girl, moving silently. Rachel's hand moved to her service weapon, but before she could act, the figure noticed her and darted away into the shadows, leaving behind only a faint scent of cologne. She sprinted after him, her footsteps pounding against the pavement, heart racing as she pursued the figure into a darkened alleyway. But when she rounded the corner, he was gone, leaving her standing alone, her breaths heavy and fast in the cold night air. As Rachel dug deeper, she uncovered a connection. Both victims had attended a specific night class together, an elective on forensic psychology. She pulled the class roster and examined it carefully, paying close attention to any names that stood out. One name caught her eye, an older student, someone who'd registered late, a man in his early 30s who seemed out of place among the young undergraduates. She jotted down the information, deciding to pursue this lead in the days ahead. Rachel's days had bled into nights since the discovery of the second victim. The case files were now permanently sprawled across her desk, with every detail scrutinized and cataloged. She was convinced that the killer was hiding among the student population, someone who blended in, observing from the shadows, perhaps even attending the candlelight vigils organized by terrified students. After narrowing her search down to the older student who had enrolled late in the forensic psychology class, Rachel dug into his records. His name was Michael Tate. Though he appeared to be a low-key individual, his academic file had a few unusual notes. Michael had transferred from another state without many details, and his class attendance was sporadic, as if he only showed up when he felt like it. Rachel reached out to her contact in the other state to get a deeper look into his background. Within hours, a small package of information arrived in her email inbox. A thin but telling record. Michael had been detained once for disturbing the peace, an incident involving a former girlfriend who had filed a restraining order against him. The case was dismissed due to lack of evidence, but Rachel's instincts tingled. The pieces weren't coming together yet, but she felt she was closer. Just a bit closer, she whispered to herself, echoing the taunt from the killer's anonymous letter. Rachel's investigation led her to Professor Lyle, who taught the forensic psychology class attended by both victims and Michael Tate. Lyle was a stout, graying man with a keen interest in his students and a good memory for faces. "Detective Torres," he greeted her, his face creased with concern as they met in his dimly lit office. This situation has everyone on edge. 2 of my students, gone in such horrific ways. He shook his head. I'll do anything I can to help. Rachel explained her theory, mentioning Michael and the unusual circumstances around his enrollment. Professor Lyle nodded, thoughtfully tracing the edge of his glasses with his finger. He's different, Lyle admitted. Quiet, keeps to himself. But he's sharp, extremely observant. Sometimes I feel he's studying everyone in the room, including me. Rachel's skin prickled. Has he ever acted in a way that made you feel uneasy? The professor paused. I can't say he's ever done anything outwardly disturbing, but he has a presence that's hard to ignore. Other students have mentioned feeling watched. Rachel's mind spun with the new information. If you think of anything else, anything unusual, reach out to me immediately, she said, pressing her card into his hand. Leaving the office, Rachel felt a renewed sense of urgency. Michael was a loose thread in her investigation, and she was certain pulling on it would reveal something crucial. Rachel spent hours analyzing the evidence from both crime scenes, laying out each piece of evidence on the precinct's board. Crime scene photos, coroner's reports, and a detailed timeline of each victim's last known whereabouts. As she reviewed it all, a chilling realization surfaced, a specific pattern in the way the bodies had been positioned. Each victim had been arranged with their hands pointing toward a particular landmark on campus, almost as if marking points on a map. Emily, the first victim, had been positioned facing north toward the library. The second victim's body was found facing south, in the direction of the Performing Arts Building. Rachel shivered as she marked the spots on the map. Her heart raced as she added another hypothetical point on the map, this time to the east. If her theory was correct, it would point toward a building that hadn't been on her radar, the Student Union, a central hub bustling with activity. Was this where the killer planned to strike next? Rachel's team set up surveillance around the Student Union, hoping to catch any suspicious activity. She patrolled the campus herself, disguised as an evening jogger, blending into the crowd. The campus was busy, students lingering in groups, laughing, and unaware of the lurking danger. Rachel kept her gaze sharp, her senses heightened for any unusual movement. Near midnight, as she was about to call it a night, she caught sight of a figure slipping into the shadows near the east side of the Student Union. Her adrenaline surged, and she followed at a cautious distance, her hand hovering near her holster. The figure moved with a deliberate slowness, pausing every so often to glance around. He seemed to know his way through the dimly lit path, his steps practiced. Rachel quickened her pace, narrowing the distance. Her heart raced as she called out, "Police! Stop where you are." The figure turned, a young man with wide, startled eyes. He held his hands up, visibly shaking. I am just trying to get back to my dorm, officer." Rachel scrutinized him, her gaze piercing. He was nervous, but there was no sign of the cold precision she'd come to expect from the killer. With a sigh, she let him go, but not without a stern warning to avoid walking alone at night. Whoever the killer was, he was still out there. The next morning, Rachel awoke to find another envelope slipped under her apartment door. Heart pounding, she tore it open. Inside was a photo of herself, taken from behind as she patrolled the Student Union. Her own shadow loomed in the image, stark and haunting. Scrawled on the back were the words, "You're closer, detective, but are you fast enough?" This was no ordinary killer. He was brazen, meticulous, and he knew her every move. For the first time in her career, Rachel felt a knot of dread tighten in her chest. She had become part of the game. Determined to confront Michael Tate, Rachel requested a private meeting with him in a controlled environment. The tension was thick as Michael sat across from her, his expression unreadable. She leaned forward, her gaze unflinching. "Michael, you've become a person of interest in an ongoing investigation," she stated firmly. "I need to know where you were on the nights of the murders." Michael smirked, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Detective, I assure you I was in my dorm, or the library. I have nothing to hide." His calm demeanor only heightened Rachel's suspicion. She pressed him further, subtly referencing his past and the restraining order, but Michael remained frustratingly evasive. As the interview concluded, Rachel left the room with more questions than answers, but a gnawing certainty that Michael was hiding something. She was certain she had brushed against the darkness, even if she hadn't yet found the proof. Rachel's phone rang early the next morning. Another body had been found, this time near the student dormitories. The victim was posed similarly, pointing westward, a completion of the gruesome map that Rachel had begun to piece together. Rushing to the scene, Rachel found herself sickened by the brutality of the display. But amidst her horror, she also felt a strange determination. The killer was drawing closer, taunting her at every step. Each victim was a message, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he turned his attention fully on her. Rachel's hands trembled as she held the latest taunting message from the killer, and the surveillance photos seemed to close in on her. The air in her apartment felt heavy. Every shadow looked suspicious. She hadn't slept in days, her mind racing with the killer's words. Determined to keep her wits, Rachel began documenting everything meticulously, hoping to find a pattern she might have missed. A faint memory of an old, unfinished investigation resurfaced, details that mirrored this case but had gone cold. She felt herself spiraling, wondering if the killer had ties to her past cases. This was no longer a hunt for justice. It was a battle for her sanity. Rachel took a calculated risk and drove to the precinct late at night, accessing a sealed case file from 5 years prior. The case involved a string of similar murders in a nearby city, though it had gone unsolved. The brutality, the taunts left behind, everything paralleled the Gainesville murders. As she pored over the files, Rachel noticed a connection. A certain police consultant had worked on the cold case. She hadn't thought of him in years, but he had shown an unusual fascination with the killer's methods. Could he have developed an obsession that eventually drove him to copy the crimes? Just then, a loud noise in the precinct shattered her concentration. She tensed, her hand instinctively moving toward her holstered gun. She was alone, or so she thought. The noise turned out to be harmless. A cleaning staff member dropping supplies, but her heightened sense of paranoia remained. Rachel arranged to meet Michael Tate in a monitored interrogation room. She was tired of waiting, convinced he held valuable information. Michael entered the room calmly, his face devoid of emotion. "Detective Torres," he greeted, his voice unsettlingly calm. "I can tell you've been busy." Rachel didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need answers, Michael. You were in close proximity to both murder scenes, and you've been on my radar long before this." He smirked. "Is that so? I didn't realize I was of such interest." The conversation took a dark turn as Michael subtly hinted at knowing details about the murders that hadn't been released to the public. His demeanor was chilling, as though he relished the attention. After a tense exchange, Rachel left the room, more unsettled than ever. Michael's knowledge couldn't be coincidental. But was he the killer, or was he just playing mind games? With a sense of dread, Rachel followed up on a hunch from her late-night file review. She uncovered a derelict cabin on the outskirts of town, matching a property owned by a relative of Michael Tate. Armed with a flashlight and accompanied by her partner, Officer Jensen, she explored the abandoned structure. Dusty crime scene photos and articles from the previous case were plastered on the walls, along with recent photos of her. Her heart raced as she found chilling evidence. Handwritten notes detailing each victim, maps of the university, and several disturbing sketches of her own face. A creaking noise made her turn, but no one was there. The paranoia was seeping in. As they left, Rachel glanced back, feeling a mix of dread and fury. The killer was taunting her personally, knowing she'd find this place. Back at the precinct, Rachel sifted through the evidence, piecing together details of the case. She grew convinced that Michael Tate was either the killer or an accomplice. But the cabin revealed something even more sinister, hints at a possible accomplice. She confided in her partner Jensen, discussing her theory about a two-killer scenario. Together, they began reevaluating witness reports and CCTV footage. In several instances, the footage caught what appeared to be two men in different locations near the times of the murders. Each discovery brought them closer to a terrifying conclusion. They were dealing with a carefully orchestrated partnership, one killer possibly serving as a mentor to the other. Determined to catch the killer, Rachel set up a covert operation near the campus. Her strategy was to flush out the killers by making it appear as though she had cracked the case. She held a press conference hinting at new evidence, a ploy to agitate the suspects into making a move. Her strategy worked, but too well. That evening, as Rachel returned to her apartment, she found her door slightly ajar. Her stomach dropped. She drew her weapon, cautiously entering her home. Inside, the air was thick with silence. On her living room table lay a note, a photograph, and a single rose. The photo showed Rachel in her precinct, deep in conversation with Jensen. Scrawled across the note was a chilling message. "You're closer than ever, detective. But is he really your ally?" Shaken and unable to trust anyone, Rachel went on high alert. She confronted Jensen, demanding the truth. He looked bewildered, but before he could answer, a call came in. Another body had been found on campus. As they arrived at the crime scene, the setup was unmistakable. The victim was positioned as a grim clue, pointing to the killer's next intended target, Rachel. Rachel's pulse raced. This was no longer a mystery. It was a countdown. Rachel's hands trembled as she combed through the last remaining clues, piecing together every scrap of information she'd gathered. She finally connected the dots, realizing with a cold shock that the killer had manipulated her at every step. The person she trusted most, her partner, Jensen, had been orchestrating the murders with eerie precision, using their partnership as cover. Memories of shared cases, moments of vulnerability, and instances where Jensen had been inexplicably present flooded her mind, each now tainted with suspicion. Determined to bring him down, Rachel kept her discovery to herself, knowing she would only have one chance to confront him. She resolved to set a trap, using herself as bait. Late one evening, Rachel invited Jensen to a remote location under the pretense of chasing a new lead. It was an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, cloaked in shadows, mirroring the desolation she felt inside. As she waited, every sound and flicker of light heightened her senses, her heart pounding in her chest. Jensen arrived, his demeanor calm yet calculating. Rachel sensed his awareness of her suspicion, and the air grew thick with unspoken tension. She confronted him, her voice steady but her pulse racing. "You were there all along, weren't you?" she said, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "Watching me, guiding me to dead ends." Jensen's calm facade cracked, revealing a glint of sinister pride. He took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I always wondered when you'd figure it out, Rachel. You always were too good for your own good." As the two stood facing each other in the dim light, a sudden movement broke the silence. Jensen lunged at Rachel, but she was prepared, dodging and drawing her weapon. They grappled in a brutal fight, each knowing the other's tactics too well. The sound of their struggle echoed through the empty building as they battled, both physically and psychologically, for control. In a final twist, Rachel managed to disarm Jensen, pinning him to the ground. But in one last, desperate attempt, he whispered chilling words. "There are others, Rachel. You'll never find them all." She hesitated for a split second, the horror of his implications sinking in. But she knew she couldn't let him manipulate her any longer. She silenced him, calling in backup to make the arrest. With Jensen behind bars, Rachel finally breathed a sigh of relief. The case had taken a toll on her, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. But as she reviewed the evidence one final time, she uncovered small, disturbing details, suggestions that perhaps Jensen hadn't acted alone. A series of coded notes and photos hinted at a larger network, possibly connecting back to other cold cases she thought had been solved. The realization haunted her, leaving her with a chilling question. Was this the end, or just the beginning? Weeks later, Rachel walked through the now quiet campus, feeling the weight of the past months lift ever so slightly. She'd brought closure to families and freed the town from fear, but deep down, a gnawing unease remained. As she reached her car, she noticed an envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Inside was a photograph of her, taken from a distance with a single word scrawled on the back. Soon. The story ends with Rachel looking over her shoulder, knowing she's never truly alone, the echoes of the shadows still haunting her.